Hey everybody, today we're jumping into day 2 of Unit 4, and today we're going to cover a lot of very, very big topics, starting with the War of 1812. We're going to talk about the influence of John Marshall and the Supreme Court under him, as well as talking about the Monroe Doctrine. So let's go ahead and jump right in. So President number 4, again, Jefferson would serve his 2 terms. And the Democratic Republican, James Madison, would defeat the Federalist Charles Pinckney in the election of 1808. You will see that the Federalists do have a somewhat little bit of a re-emergence because of the unpopularity of the Embargo Act that we left off talking about last time. But you can look at the election results there, and it was pretty much a landslide in favor of James Madison. Now, again, we talked about this French Revolution and what was going on would continue to be a thorn in the side of presidents. Madison had to deal with the same issues in Europe that Jefferson had to deal with. In 1809, the Non-Intercourse Act would be passed, which said that Americans could trade with all nations except for Britain and France. So they are taking it again and changing that Embargo Act and now said, hey, now we can trade with everybody except for Britain and France. In 1810, you have Macon's Bill number 2 passed, which stated that if Britain or France agreed to respect U.S. rights at sea, that the U.S. would prohibit trade with that nation's foe. So basically what that meant is if France agreed to respect our rights at sea, then we would grant exclusive rights to trade with them over Britain. And the reason that Jefferson did that, or that Madison pushed for this, is, again, even though we had re-allowed trade with all countries except Britain and France are your 2 major world powers at this time, and not being able to trade with either one of those countries would really hurt us. Now, if you think about with this bill number 2, if we had come to some sort of agreement with like France in that, how do you think Britain would look at that? They would look at that as us allying with France and almost that we should be at war with Britain because we are helping out their enemy. Now, Napoleon, seeing the value of this, he would jump on this deal and the U.S. would embargo just Britain. But France would continue to seize U.S. ships during this time. So again, Napoleon, not being a man of his word, would continue to seize our ships. And that's going to bring us up to the War of 1812. Encourage you to watch this funny video here from College Humor talking about the War of 1812, because the War of 1812 is one in U.S. history that is very much misunderstood, and people don't know a lot about that. I also have a point of view activity to do as well on your point of view on the war. So, what do you know about the War of 1812? Well, most people know Washington, D.C. was burned during the War of 1812. Dolly Madison, with the help of some White House servants as well, some of them being slaves or people of color, helped save the classic portrait of George Washington from the White House and prevented that from being burning. And Francis Scott Key would write the Star-Spangled Banner while being held on a British ship in the Baltimore harbor during that time at Fort McHenry. So, again, these European tensions, Napoleonic Wars have been going on 1802 to 1815. As Napoleon continued to conquer these European countries, he would cut off their trade to Britain and order the seizure of neutral ships. That's why they kept seizing our ships. The British responded with their own blockade that stopped ships carrying goods to Europe, which also included our ships, and the British would use these raids to replenish its forces through impressment. And basically, impressment was the act of what the British would do is go aboard an American ship or any ship and say, hey, you're in the British Navy now, you are going to be part of us. And that's what that picture you see down there is of the American sailor with his hands up and the British soldier pointing a gun at him. Obviously, Americans not happy about this whole idea of impressment and our guys just being told that they are part of the British military now. Now, in some circumstances, you are actually seeing sailors from a variety of different countries who claimed that they were Americans when they were caught because they thought that because they were being Americans that they would be let go. And some of these people who claim to be Americans, some of them would actually get American flag like tattoos on them to prove that they were American. They would be taken and impressed into the British military as well. Now, remember the Embargo Act. This is a famous cartoon about the Embargo Act. And you can see he says, oh, this cursed, oh, grab me. If you look at oh, grab me backwards, that is, or you flip it around, that is embargo. And again, this is a criticism of that old Embargo Act. So In response to Britain helping out the natives in the West, because that was another issue, a lot of Americans believe that the British were helping out and encouraging the Indians in the West to fight against us. And because of that, on top of the seizing of American ships and the practice of impressment, that is going to lead Republicans in Congress, Henry Clay and John C. Calhoun, to push James Madison towards war. Madison would ask Congress for a declaration of war, and they would grant that. And basically, Americans were fed up with what was happening and how the British were treating us. Now, our official reason for this war would be because of violations of our neutral rights as a country. Ironically, with that, Britain had agreed to suspend their naval blockade, but it actually reached the White House after war had already been declared. And again, that's the nature of living in the 18th century. Communication isn't very good, so that kind of thing happens, and that'll actually come to effect later in the war when you see probably our greatest victory of the War of 1812 is going to be a battle that happens after a peace treaty had already been signed. But the word didn't reach New Orleans in time. So, War of 1812, how does it go? April 1813, you're going to see Americans would burn Toronto before withdrawing from Canada. So there was an attempt, again, to go into Canada. In September of 1813, Oliver Perry would defeat a small British flotilla on Lake Erie. In October that year, William Henry Harrison would beat the British and the Indians at the Battle of Thames in Canada. And in March of 1814, Andrew Jackson would defeat the Creek Indians in the Battle of Horseshoe Bend. So you see there are a lot of good things going there, but really, when the British focus their full attention on defeating us, that's going to be when things go really sour for us and go south. Because again, we didn't have the strongest military in the world during this time. So August of 1814, British ships would actually sail right up the Chesapeake Bay and attack Washington, D.C. They would burn the Capitol and the White House. And really, we had no defenses against that at all. We knew it was happening. We knew they were coming, and we couldn't do much about that. Christmas Eve of 1814, you'll see the Treaty of Ghent would be signed, which basically, at the end of the War of 1812, everything goes back to exactly how it was before the war. So nothing changed as a result of the War of 1812. But again, because of the slow communication, January 8th, 1815, the U.S. military would have their greatest victory of the War of 1812 when Andrew Jackson would defeat British forces in the Battle of New Orleans. And again, this would be very important because this is something that really pushes Andrew Jackson to prominence within the United States. Now, one of the interesting stories is with the burning of Washington, D.C., Admiral Cockburn, that's how you say his name, Admiral Cockburn, Americans quite frequently made fun of his last name, and you can imagine the way that they actually said it. So when he burned Washington, D.C., one of the orders that he made was to be sure that all the C's are destroyed so the rascals cannot any longer abuse my name. So this is kind of one of those funny oddities in U.S. history there. Admiral Cockburn, though, would actually eventually be knighted by the crown. So he would become Sir Cockburn to us. And you can see the painting of him there. And in the background of that is Washington, D.C. on fire. Again, this is a political cartoon you'll often see with the War of 1812. That's James Madison taking on the king there. And as you can see, the king has quite a gusher because he's gotten beat up by James Madison. This is another one from the War of 1812. Again, that is showing an American sailor there saying we owe allegiance to no crown. So basically, we don't owe allegiance to the king and to the British at all. So another event that comes out of the War of 1812, as we kind of break it down and analyze this, would be the Hartford Convention in 1814. Again, we had talked about before, last class, about the Federalists calling together and the New England Federalists talking about secession and possibly leaving the United States. And during the War of 1812, you're going to see the Massachusetts Federalists would call for these conventions to lay the foundation for a radical reform of the National Compact, basically meaning they wanted to change the Constitution. The Federalist delegates during this convention would call for one, secession as a possibility. Again, the New England states leaving the United States. They would also call for a revision of the Constitution through amendments. One, limit a president to 1 4-year term. So get rid of the idea of serving 2 terms. But another, rotate states, which is a very interesting idea. And you might be wondering, well, why did they want that so much? Well, if you think about it to this point, we're on our 4th president. and 3 out of the 4 presidents come from Virginia. They were tired of that, and they wanted a rotation of presidents to feel like that their interests were being heard. Next up, restriction of commercial embargoes to 60 days. Again, remember the devastating effects of that embargo act that had been passed, so they wanted to limit that. And also, they wanted a 2/3 majority of Congress to be able to declare war, prohibit trade, or admit new states. And again, all of these things were in response to things that James Madison and Thomas Jefferson had done as president. So in order for the Federalists to really get their way, the war would have to go very, very badly for the United States. And even though Washington, D.C. would be burned, the war did not go badly enough for the U.S. And some people would claim that the U.S. had victory in the end. But either way, because of how the war ended, it didn't go super poorly for the United States. So really, in the end, the Federalists were left looking very, very unpatriotic. And this is going to lead to the death of the Federalist Party. The Federalist Party, after the War of 1812, they would die off largely, again, due to the Hartford Convention, and plus the fact that they had just been dying off as it was. You will see the Republican Party. A lot of these old Federalists just join into the Democratic Republican Party. So you're going to see the Democratic Republicans split into 2 groups: the National Republicans and the Jeffersonian Republicans. And you'll see the Nationalist Republicans are the ones that draw a lot of the former Federalists. And the election of 1818 would be really the final knife in the heart of the Federalists and the first party system. And that's really what we call the end of the first party system. And I joke with Jefferson there, saying it's a shame Hamilton isn't around for this. Now, during the War of 1812, you're going to see that the British, like they had done during the American Revolution, they promised freedom to any slave that would fight on their side. So you will see that the war led to thousands of slaves escaping to British forces and then leaving with them after the war. So that was one of the effects of the War of 1812. You also see another effect of the War of 1812 is that the U.S. would increase the efforts to prevent a future foreign invasion, including the building of Fort Monroe here in Virginia. Fort Monroe is actually on the site of Point Comfort, which was the point in which the first slaves actually showed up here to U.S. shores. But they would build Fort Monroe there. And again, the purpose of Fort Monroe was to help defend the Chesapeake Bay and be a way to be able to alarm if we did see ships coming in our battle against them. We could contact Washington, D.C. and let them know that, hey, people are coming. We need to get out of town or build up our defenses. And you can actually visit Fort Monroe during President Obama's administration. Actually, before that, the fort had been decommissioned as no longer a U.S. military fort under George W. Bush, and Barack Obama named it a national park because of its influence in history and because it would be used up through World War II as a U.S. military base. Actually, even that was the last major war that it was used as a military base. So, and you can see the pictures there of Fort Monroe and how it is structured there off the coast, facing out at the Chesapeake Bay. Now, the War of 1812, very, very interesting. James Robertson, who I've mentioned and talked about before, Dr. Bud Robertson, he said, one can choose to interpret the past according to individual feelings. Take the War of 1812, for example. The Americans think they won it. The Canadians know they won it. The British never heard of it. And again, what does this say about how we view history? We view it through our own lenses and through our own backgrounds and our own feelings. And just remember that when you are viewing history, that it's all based upon where you come from is largely how you view history. Now, the Americans think that they won it because after the war, we would get some more land out of this. The Canadians know they won it because the Canadians were actually part of the force that marched in with Admiral Cockburn and helped burn Washington, D.C., and the British never heard of it because, honestly, British history is much more extensive than United States history. And this little inconsequential war to them doesn't really matter to their history because it didn't bring any large-scale changes for Great Britain. So with this, I encourage you to think about, if you were president, how might you handle these issues? How might you handle foreign policy if you were president? Now, I want you to watch this song here. This is the War of 1812 song done by a Canadian group called Three Dead Trolls and a Baggie. And it really does show what the Canadian view of the war is. Now, I will preface this that this whole song is satire. They end it with the closing screen saying, hey, this is a joke. We love Americans. This isn't to offend Americans, but really is a funny song about what their view of the War of 1812 is. So what is the legacy of the War of 1812? The U.S. would gain respect for surviving 2 wars. The U.S. would accept Canada as part of the British Empire. The Federalist Party, as we talked about, they would be ended as a national force. The Hartford Convention would set some precedent for the future if you think about the Civil War. And again, this whole talk of secession, later that would be brought up by the South as well. Indians who had now been abandoned by the British, who pulled out pretty much all of their military here in the New World, were forced to surrender the land to white settlers. You would see U.S. factories get built up during the British naval blockade, so that would be good. We were forced to have to produce some of our own things and not depend upon Europe. You would have war heroes emerge from this, Andrew Jackson and William Henry Harrison, who would both later go on to become president and who were both political leaders. And also you would see that nationalism would grow stronger in the U.S., as well as the belief that U.S. future laid in the West and not in Europe. So as far as the AP perspective goes, we would say the War of 1812 is a draw, even though you do have some good things that come out of this for the United States. The Virginia SOLs pretty much say that the War of 1812 was a victory for the United States, which I would argue historically isn't correct. But certainly some people could judge it as a victory when you look at some of the benefits that the U.S. got out of that. So who won the war? Good question. You could say the U.S. because we did gain a claim to the Oregon Territory, and you saw more people move into Florida, which we would eventually negotiate to receive from Spain. Canada resisted a U.S. invasion during this time, and Britain burned Washington, D.C. All reasons why you could say the different sides may have won the war. Now, as we jump into the Marshall Court here, instead of explaining each one of these cases in details, I've attached a link there to a video that explains each one of these cases and all the background to it. I'm just going to hit on what the big decision was in it. We've already talked about Marbury and Madison in the past, about judicial review. McCulloch versus Maryland in 1819, that comes up with the idea of implied powers. That there are certain things within the Constitution that aren't directly said in it, but are implied. The example that I always like to use, our founding fathers could have never known about the idea of having an Air Force, the whole idea of having fighter jets and nuclear bombs and all that stuff. But it is implied under the power of the government to have a military that we can have that stuff, that we can have an Air Force, and we can have these advanced weapons that we do. And specifically, this case had to do with the implied power to have a national bank. And then Gibbons versus Ogden, this is where the government is able to step in when you have a conflict between two states over interstate commerce. This is the government stepping in. And really the lasting influence that you're going to see with the Federalist Party is, even though they die out, they have John Marshall here, and he greatly defines and expands the power of the court. So whenever you think about John Marshall, think about him expanding and growing the power of the court. And again, if you want more details on the specifics of these cases, you can check out those videos there. Otherwise, you only need to know why the case itself is important and what the result of that case was. Now, president number 6 is going to be James Monroe. I've included a link in there to a Disney video about James Monroe that's going to explain his presidency. But James Monroe's presidency is going to be known as the era of good feelings because you have the death of the Federalist Party, and you have a relative political harmony during this time where you only have political party. Now, as I mentioned, the Republican Party would take in all these old Federalists and kind of divide into two areas, the Nationalists and the Jeffersonians. You can see the different leaders of each of those sides. Jefferson, even though he's no longer involved in politics and he has retired to Monticello, he would say you see so many of these new Republicans maintaining in Congress the rankest doctrines of the old Federalists. And Jefferson saw what happened. He knew that a lot of the Federalists had joined the Republican Party, and he was not super happy about that. Now, cultural nationalism. You're going to see that in this early nation that people were very excited about the prospects and about the future of our country. A lot of people during this time had no interest in all the European politics and what was going on over there. And you're going to see nationalism and patriotism would really begin to dominate the 19th century. And you're going to see that reflected in art and in many other ways here in the country. Gilbert Stuart, Charles Wilson Peale and John Trumbull all would paint the heroes of the American Revolution. So a lot of these famous paintings that you see of the American Revolution and of George Washington, that kind of thing, were painted during this time. You would also see Noah Webster, who would come out with his blueback speller, and in that he would promote the whole idea of American patriotism. So you're going to see a lot of the patriotism in our country during this time. Now, on the foreign policy side of things, you are going to see the Monroe Doctrine come out, and really a definition of Europe. What is your role in the North and South America? And basically, you shouldn't have a role in North and South America. And the reason why this policy was put forth is because the British were starting to get more interested in South America, and we were worried about what that meant to us as a country. So the Monroe Doctrine, even though this was written by John Quincy Adams, it would be called the Monroe Doctrine because Monroe was president, and he is the one that actually produced it. And it would have 4 points. One, the American continent should not be considered for future colonization by any European powers. So basically, Europe, stay out of North and South America. We are not for you to colonize. Two, here in the Western Hemisphere, we are different than Europe. Europe likes the old monarchies and that kind of stuff, and here we like republics. And again, I jokingly put it there, we ain't like you, bunch of king-loving fools. We are different, and we're saying stay out. We're different from you. We like doing things in a different and a new way. Also, the U.S. would regard as a threat to its own peace and safety any attempts by European powers to impose their system here in the Western Hemisphere. And basically what that was a veiled threat. Like, if you mess with the Americas, you're going to get the red, white, and boom. If you come over here, we consider it a threat, which would lead to war. And number four, the U.S. would not interfere in European affairs. Basically, if you stay out of our business, we will stay out of yours. And you're going to see this Monroe Doctrine really goes in step with George Washington's warning in his farewell address of staying out of entangling alliances. That's what we were trying to do with this. And you're going to see the Monroe Doctrine really stays U.S. policy through pretty much World War I. We would keep this idea of the Monroe Doctrine, at least in our relationship with Europe. Teddy Roosevelt would add on to this idea of the Monroe Doctrine, but really this would be our dominant U.S. foreign policy through World War I. And you can see some political cartoons here of the Monroe Doctrine, again, basically saying, hey, stay out of North and South America. This is for the United States, and this is basically, we don't want you here, and that's what these political cartoons are showing. Now, John Quincy Adams had served in under his father, had done a lot of stuff overseas, and really had been groomed for a government position. He would be Secretary of State under Monroe. And under that, he would negotiate several different things. The Rush-Bagot Treaty, which limited the American and British naval forces on the Great Lakes, so that basically the Great Lakes would become a place of commerce versus the concern for war. The 49th Parallel Agreement, which set the border between the U.S. and Canada with Great Britain. So that would be good. And then the Adams-Onis Treaty, which would be what would persuade Spain to cede Florida to the United States, which we had already said that a lot of Americans had already moved there as a result of the War of 1812. So you can read there the final thing that you need to do for today. And just know that through this period, again, this era of good feelings does mark a period in U.S. history where we have relative peace and harmony, not just throughout the world, or at least for the United States militarily, but also politically here. Now, this would mark, with the end of Monroe's presidency, the end of this Republican dynasty of president. And you're going to see, as this old guard of people dies off and leaves office, that U.S. politics are going to start to change in a pretty big way. So, as always, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me, and I'll help you however possible. Otherwise, have a fantastic day.